Yesterday, in the past, I mentioned also there's a famous Medrash Tanchuma where Rabbi Akiva would have this discussion with Tonus Tropis. He was the Roman governor who eventually put him to death, about whose action is more perfect, man's or God's. And Rabbi Akiva says to Tonus Tropis, to this Roman pagan heathen, that man's action is more perfect than God's. He says, how could you say that? God created heaven and earth. Could man create heaven and earth? He says, well, I'm not talking about it. We're talking about something which is within the realm of possibility for a human being to contribute. Man's contribution, something that he can contribute, and God's contribution, whose investment or involvement brings about a greater level of perfection. So Tonus Tropis says, of course, God. He says, no, I disagree. And he says, he gave the example, if you have a kernel of wheat that grows out of the ground, as perfect it is, it's edible at a very minimal level, right? We said that when you process wheat, eventually you say, Bar Min Mizonos. If you eat the kernel of wheat out of the ground, you say, Bar Pri Adama. Because it's the growth of the ground. It's the fruit of the ground. But if you take it and you mill it, and you turn it into dough, and you bake it into a loaf of bread, he says to Tonus Tropis, what's more perfect, the kernel or the finished loaf of bread? She says, of course, loaf of bread. So he says, you see, man's contribution or involvement is greater than God's. The kernel is at a very minimal level, edibility level, and the bread is fully edible, even desirable to the person. So Tonus Tropis says to Rabbi Akiva, so what about circumcision? Why, if God created man with a foreskin, why does the Jew mutilate himself? Why does he cut off the foreskin? So he says, you don't understand. I explained to you, God created the world imperfect. The objective of man is to perfect God's imperfect world. That's what he answered him. So the Or Chaim HaKadosh asks, I wanted Tonus Tropis get it. From the example of the kernel to the finished loaf of bread, it's clear God created the world imperfect, and man's responsibility is to perfect the world. So identically, man has a foreskin. So God created the man imperfect. It's man's responsibility to perfect the person. So that's why he cut off the foreskin. So why didn't Tonus Tropis get it? Seemingly, the equivalent case of the kernel to the finished product should automatically give him an understanding why a Jew has to circumcise himself. Why did he get it? And he says, that's exactly what I told you. God created man imperfect, or the world imperfect, and if the world is the human being, so it's the objective of the human being to perfect himself, and that's why we cut off the foreskin. So he explains that the whole concept of spirituality, that all he understood, this Roman governor, was the physical value of existence. The spiritual value, the value of removing the foreskin, he didn't see that as an act of perfection. Because why does the Jew cut off his foreskin? Of course, the Torah says that's the bris kodesh. That's the holy covenant. And that's what we say in the second bracha of Birchas Hamazon, Abris choshech samtim v'sarenu. This is the covenant which is engraved in our flesh. That's what it is. But why is that the covenant engraved in our flesh? So according to the Or Chaim HaKadosh, he says, as we discussed, Hashem created Adam without a foreskin. The foreskin, the covering, was only an expression of the Ra, of the evil, of the Eitz Hadas. Besides that's the Zohar. Before the eating of the Eitz Hadas, he did not have a foreskin. It's only due to the eating and ingesting that the most lethal representation of evil, that was the expression of the covering of the foreskin. For the Jew to be able to function, we're so entombed and so infected with evil, the only way we have relevance to make proper choices and to have that balance, to be able to relate to Taryag Mitzvos, 248 positive commandments, 365 negative commandments, we have to remove that. Otherwise we're off balance. So therefore, he had no understanding of that. The whole concept of establishing a spiritual equilibrium for the Jew, he had no idea. But that's what Kiva said. The human being is imperfect. The Jew is imperfect. By removing that foreskin, you're putting him into a state. Now he's ready to you're ready to launch the Jew from the 8 days old to be able to make those decisions in life, to be able to be in touch with the various channels of spirituality to make those choices.